just petted again, and we are going to talk about Chapter 9. Chapter 9 is known to us, usually vernacularly, as USAID. It is the Agency for International Development, and my friend Stephanie is stupid enough to have an extroverted conversation with me about this chapter, and this chapter was not light. There is a lot going on in this chapter, and I will be the first person to admit I think I thought I knew what USAID was. Nope, sure didn't. So, Stephanie, welcome. There is no expectation of expertise other than you're a person who can read. That is the expectation. So, congratulations. And if you are like everybody else, I'm curious, is there one particular takeaway that you'd like to come in off the gate out with first?
So if I had only like 30 seconds to summarize what I think is going on in this chapter, there is a suggestion that um, aid to developing nations should be uh, overtly pro-life. And when I say pro-life, I'm using their word for pro-life to mean anti-abortion,
Right.
which is in my opinion, is different than pro-life. But that's another that's another discussion for another day. And that they would also like to be overtly anti-China or overtly in competition with China in terms of influence. And um, and that's like those are really the two big things that are in this chapter. But like there is, like you said, so much going on here because the mission of USAID is very, very big and broad, and there are a lot of factors to take into consideration when in terms of both U.S. interests in the rest of the world and also like the effects of aid and development in the places where we do those things. So there's a lot going on here.
So totally agree. And some of that I think is it's interesting that there's so many tentacles, and I didn't know about any of them. And some of it I think is also kind of like connected to one particular piece that we need to be thoughtful about, right? So, as I have stated probably in most of these videos, the number one priority of the Heritage Foundation in the mandate for leadership is non-partisan. They don't know what that word means. Civil servants who are loyal to the president's agenda. And then this would be the agenda, right? So let's take using foreign aid in development countries to be pro-life, which is a very, very loud line in this chapter, but it shows up in a lot of other chapters, right? So that to get into the Heritage Foundation mindset so that we know what it is. So first off, federal level access to abortion is illegal in the United States. And so I do think it is important to mention that because of the Supreme Court's overturning of Dobbs, any federal thing that is promoting abortion is now going against what the Supreme Court says, right? Now, I don't agree with the Dobbs decision. I'm not saying at all. But I do think because of the Dobbs decision, when it says you have to overturn this stuff, that technically follows because when Roe v. Wade won and federal access to abortion was happened, all of the things that were denying access to abortion on a federal level, they had to stop, right? And so then the people who were mad about that had to wait 50 years to get their way. So now we can be mad that they're going to overturn this stuff. But what I think is important is I would like to take that reality and put it over here. I'm not denying its existence, but we're talking about US tax dollars being limited to a specific Christian view with a prioritization of heterosexual married couples so that it is not inclusive to all kinds of women's health care. It's not inclusive for LGBT folks. It's not inclusive for anything related to gender equity or gender equality, let alone gender affirming care, because that is where the federal funding is coming from, and it has to align with the president's agenda. And you must be loyal to the president's agenda and have one megaphone, right? That's where this is coming from. So if we can get into that mindset and you can put the fire out that might have happened by virtue of getting into that mindset, now we can look at what the chapter says. Is that helpful?
Yeah, and actually your way of saying it was more coherent than mine because I got nervous there at the get-go. But because there's actually more in terms of like the priorities of this chapter, because there's also priorities involving like climate change development and
We don't want any of that. None of
right. We don't want to invest in alternative energy sources because that's it's anyway, it's complicated. But
but I think that to be able to think about what the chapter actually says, right? So like for example, to de-radicalize agencies' politics means to make them this radical agenda versus this radical agenda. So every sentence I'm like, you keep using this word, and I do not think you know what this word means, right? But if for the rest of eternity there is going to be a Republican president that follows the Heritage Foundation's agenda, then the loyalty to that agenda makes sense. And could you please articulate what that agenda is? That's the book report we're reading, right?
yes.
It is a collection of 30 different essays, I'm using air quotes,
Sure.
um, that do not communicate with one another, although they often throw tasks and projects at other offices. And so when we're talking about USAID, we are talking about the UN, NGOs, for profit contractors that impact colonization, right? The spread of democracy, natural disasters, and man made crises inside the US and where the US interests are for other countries or at least land masses or locations that the US has a usually financial or strategic investment in. That is the overview, I think.
Yeah. And I tried to approach this from a real analytical standpoint. So the very first thing I did was like go back to grade school and consider the voice of the author. Like, who is this author and what is the perspective that they're bringing to this? And so the author of this chapter is actually has like a decades long career in international um, involvement and he's highly qualified. Like I found this author to be very knowledgeable about this sector. And so
Yeah.
I have absolutely no objections with the credentials of this author. So he's a he is a guy who knows what he's talking about.
Right.
One
Which
thing
is terrifying, right?
right.
Like,
Well, one thing that I found in this, and I browsed several of the other chapters as well. And one thing I found in this, but in particular in this chapter, as well as in the others, is the use of language that you
mhm.
like mentioned. The terminology is not always, or the use of language is not always disciplined. And so what is presented as fact is often either like laced with opinion or has no reference or footnote to indicate where that information might have come from.
Who needs citations?
If this was a paper that you had to write for school, you would get points off for your reference section because
Uh-huh.
there's just not always any, or there's statements that are made out of context.
Mhm.
And so when I was reading this, I probably Googled 150 things because I would run across a sentence and I would say, huh, is that right? Or, huh, that's so interesting. I wonder where that came from. And so I went down like 100 different rabbit holes with this. But
I'm surprised we didn't bump into each other.
well, one thing that is encouraging is that anyone who can Google something can sort of untangle some of the fact uh, from opinion or really get some background that helps to place some of these statements into context. And so the combination of like thinking about the lens through which the author is looking at this, plus doing a like, and often it only took me like 30 seconds to like Google something and be like, oh,
Mhm.
that's what he means.
Yep.
So like this is, even though this chapter is huge, because the work of USAID is also huge. It's sweeping, it's global, it's involved in not only economic development, but also like global health is a major component
Mhm.
of their work. Um, and so it's really easy to get overwhelmed when reading this
Mhm.
chapter because there's each of the different sections of chapter discusses something that people will devote their entire career to. Like
Correct.
people will study some of these issues for their entire, their entire work life and disagree about procedures and strategies. And so like for a regular person to read a paragraph and say, oh, this is how it is, that it's really easy to get overwhelmed. So
Yeah. But it's easy to get overwhelmed. And I also think that most of the governmental offices, when it's talking about removing these nonpartisan people who've burrowed the language they use is burrowing their way into lifelong public servant or civil servant jobs. The burrowing is only for people who agree with a different agenda. The plan is to intentionally infiltrate and burrow in who support this agenda, right? Because again, hypocrisy. But what one of the pieces that you bring up that I think is interesting, I mean, everything you just said is interesting, and it's so incredibly easy to get lost. So one of the concepts that has been mentioned in a number of different chapters, but particularly because of this one, I went down a rabbit hole, which are on debt traps. And so I was like, what exactly is a debt trap? And what I learned, and I think it's important to mention that when we are Googling and doing research, please note that our Googling and doing research is dependent on net neutrality that just got overturned.
sure.
So now our access to the internet is going to be very limited based on where we live and how much money we pay for it because we've prioritized the neutrality of the information while we're doing research. No worries there. Don't mind me. But debt traps, which is one of China's kind of weaponized economic methodologies right now, is giving basic supplies to developing countries at a low price for a long payment plan that the developing country will eventually default on. So they owe China money. And China's not the only one to. The U.S. does this all the time. The INF does this. The WHO or WTO does this all the time. And the idea is that you get countries like in your snare, right? And so by using the same principles, the United States, this particular agenda is by promoting international religious freedom that is only the most conservative form of Christianity, right? By promoting opportunity for only heterosexual families to learn how to have a family, by promoting only a very conservative way of interpreting democracy, by promoting American dependence on natural gas, oil, and coal. This is the mindset, right? And so instead of promoting it in kind of like an open way, it is promoting it very specifically in a way that only financially supports a very small portion or population of the United States and those people who are loyal to this agenda item. Same thing goes when it talks about rare earth mining, a subject I have spent approximately zero time thinking about. But when Trump talks about buying Greenland, like to me, that just seems random, right? Like, but I'm not shocked by anything anymore, which I shouldn't be saying because then that just keeps them raising the bar to try to shock you. But Greenland is part of the Arctic Circle. China has positioned itself globally as a developing country. I'm using air quotes because it's communist status, but it is also part of the Arctic Circle. And because of climate change, that of course we do not believe in, more and more and more of the land under the melting ice shelves are becoming available. And so there is a race to who is going to be able to own the natural resources in the Arctic Circle that's going to become more and more available because we keep melting ice. So you got China, you got Greenland, you got Canada, you got the United States, and you have Russia. So these are things I have spent absolutely zero time thinking about. So not only can you get lost and overwhelmed, I think the word stupefied comes to mind, right? And what's interesting is that stupefaction, I think, is one of the motivators here, that if I can overwhelm you with these things, you kind of want to take your ball and go home. And they're like, yes, 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 we do. And that is why withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, withdrawing from NATO, withdrawing and pulling our resources in is really one of the main motivations. But it's ultimately only to benefit the financial gain of a very small portion of the population. Thoughts and comments on that, TED Talk?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned openness. The one of the themes that I noticed um, in in this and in other discussions that are going on is that when we think about development and aid being available to more people. So I'm thinking now in terms of there's like the gender equity programs that USAID. So okay, so let me back up.
Go for it.
Um, so many of these programs that USAID has been working on have been going on for not just, these are not Biden programs. These are decade-long programs. So
Right.
these have gone through leadership changes from Democrat to Republican and back again. We have all kinds of data from the policies that were in place during these periods of time that indicate whether or not those policies were effective. And so this idea that we could have, that we could be expanding development into alternative energy sources, or that we could be expanding our gender equity programs to target more than just, because like in a lot of these countries, we're not talking about like real true equity.
Mhm.
If you view this even from a binary of the genders, and you're just talking male and female, and you're looking for women's equity, like we're many of the places where USAID is working, they are we're not talking about equity. We're talking about like basic human rights, access to even primary education, even basic healthcare. So we're not even aiming for full equity in a lot of these things. So this idea that we could be expanding these equity programs, expanding development into alternative energy sources instead of only fossil fuels, it's, in my mind, it's an openness to be able to do more things for more people. And
Mhm.
it seems to me that the perspective of the conservative authors here is that it's more of like a zero-sum game. And if
Mhm.
you expand access, you're limiting, or you're somehow they the word that's used often is a war against fossil fuels, a war against women, because we are a war against women and families because we're expanding our definitions and we're expanding the things that we want to do. So the impression that I had was that there's a difference in mentality about what we're trying to accomplish, and that
Right.
by opening um, and expanding um, our definitions and our ideas about what's possible, that we're somehow taking away from men and boys because we're trying to like, I say that men and boys because one of the other, so okay, first of all, I'm all over the place, and so I apologize to anybody who is expecting anything coherent.
No, they didn't write coherently. We don't have to reflect coherently. But I think where you're heading, that I think is important, right? Is that aid versus policy. It makes a distinction between the two. And it also is making a distinction between like an ideology and like bridges and roads, right? So I will sell you these goods. I will pay for the building of this nuclear power plant or this bridge or this road is very different than let me install democracy based in Christianity here, right? All of that gets mushed together.
Yes.
And so there is an openness that is not aligned with this one agenda. And
Yes.
the ideal outcome of that agenda is a few people making a lot more money
Yeah.
and empowering this very conservative agenda. And
Yeah.
so the opening stays as long as it does this. And that's hard to wrap your brain around.
Yes. And I now you remind me that your original question was about debt traps.
No, it wasn't a question. It's just a comment, right? Is that I'd never thought about it, but it's how this is all gamified. But
Right.
to your point, Stephanie, and I don't want this to get lost, is that a few people are gamifying this because of military location, strategy, financial gain, economic gain, world power, reputation gain. And to your point, there are real people out there who don't know how to read. There is basic healthcare, access to water, um, global poverty, food insecurity. Those things are real. And it's coming at those things talking about like the profitability of chemical based fertilizers. And they shouldn't be dependent on global funding and should like pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
Yes. So there are all of these so okay. There's I don't even know where to start. And there so
Let's
there's
just take a second. Please.
right. Well, you mentioned something about fertilizers, and I was just remembering there's this one of the examples that it gives is something about Sri Lanka going organic on their fertilizers and how that it was a failed project, and because of that, obviously, like going organic fertilizer is the wrong thing to do. But that's actually not what happened. I didn't know what had happened in Sri Lanka with their farming policy. It was one of those things I had to Google and in 30 seconds I was able to gain enough context to realize, oh, this was actually just a poorly implemented process that like it was a problem, it didn't work, but it doesn't mean that changing your fertilizer type is the wrong thing to do. So it was more complicated. The point I'm saying is that people like your average person can say, oh yeah, there's an example of this policy failed in Sri Lanka. Yeah. But if you look one layer deeper and gain a little bit more context, you can see that the person who's writing this is spinning this in order to manipulate the way you feel about it. So okay, one of the I feel like a major portion of this, and the one that was most impactful to me as I was reading things, is the desire to promote anti-abortion ideas in global health aid. I have a real I have a heart for the global health. I think it is one of the most fascinating and impactful ways that we can engage with the world. And the author of this document actually says like it is a human right to have I should have
Oh, I wrote it down.
oh
And it's one of my favorites. So I do think like do a trumpet when there's something in a chapter that I am so grateful is written down
right
because I use the language in the writing that I've done about this whole project is that it's like a tiny teeny little rhinestone of hope. So
yeah
I'll read the whole thing because it's in my notes. Um, how this chapter defines basic human rights to thrive.
yes I love
Here
this
we go.
we highlighted the same thing. I'm reading it.
Okay. So um I took notes, you not the whole actual sentence. Do you want to
You
read the
want me to
actual
quote it?
sentence?
I'll quote it. This is what this
Okay,
says.
let's quote it. Let's quote it. Yes, yes, yes.
Basic human needs include equal and safe access to potable water, sanitation, food, education, healthcare, houses of worship, justice, pregnancy and family resource centers, working capital, electricity, technology, and business opportunities.
I wrote the whole thing down. I couldn't remember if I did. Yes.
We want all of those things. So this is a thing that we can agree on. So like across the aisle, everybody, 2 thumbs up.
Right. And for the record, there is a possibility that it leaves something out in the list. But like, I am pretty woefully impressed by this list.
And then
just kidding.
Then we're going to pull funding from the UN Population Fund, which, okay, so the Helms Amendment in 1973, maybe? 1970s made it illegal for federal funding to pay for abortion services in anywhere we're working in the world. So
Hyde Amendment.
Helms, whatever. Don't quote me on all of my facts. Fact check me, Google anything I say to make sure I'm not lying to you.
I know. While you still can, let me go check it. Keep going.
The upshot is it is illegal to use US taxpayer dollars to fund abortion overseas.
For the record, we're kind of potentially both wrong, but Helms Amendment 1987 says that 87, but it's federal funding for HIV/AIDS educational materials that promoted homosexuality. That's Jesse Helms.
Okay, I have conflated my amendments.
I know, but now I'm Googling Hyde Amendment.
Okay, so
Hyde Amendment, high five, we're right. It's a legislative provision that has been attached to appropriation bills every year since 1976, and it prevents the use of federal funds for abortion services with some exceptions.
Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate you fact checking me. Fact checking is
I still can until Google is no longer available.
So it is already illegal for us to be funding abortion overseas. Therefore, the organizations that we work with overseas, so NGOs, UN, whatever, so the UN Population Fund, one of the things that they do is provide abortion services, but US taxpayer dollars are not there. It's supposed to be, I don't know how it works. It's supposed to be like differentiated so that we're not paying. You know what else they do? So one of the
if it's helpful, can I explain the ludicrousy of their suggestion? So we talk about this in the DHHS chapter. So the idea is that I need services, so then I'm going to pay, but we're going to actually give this person 2 bills.
Yes.
Right. And so the separation of my money goes to this so that no state and federal bills or insurance or business or anything like that, that money goes to this.
Yes.
That is what it is suggesting.
And that's actually like, you know what? If that's a way to make it work, that's a way to make it work. But the suggestion that this Project 2025 suggests is that no federal funding go to any organization that is promoting abortion services whatsoever. So they complain that Biden reinstituted funding to the UN Population Fund. And I didn't realize, and again, don't quote me here because I don't know what happened and I don't know the context in which they're saying that. That suggests to me that the Trump administration may have pulled funding from the UN Population Fund. But the UN Population Fund also does things like treat obstetric fistula, which is the condition that 500,000 women in the world are walking around with, where you get a rupture between your, like it happens during prolonged labor in which the woman does not have access to like labor and delivery assistance or, you know, like doesn't have access to the kind of healthcare that would prevent protracted labor. So you get a rupture either between your bladder or between your bowel and your like
Bad News Bears. It's funding for Bad News Bears things that happen.
It's a bad thing. It's debilitating, and it's a women's problem. So
doesn't matter.
So the UN Population Fund provides support for victims of female genital mutilation, which is something that is culturally entrenched in many countries in the world, where it's like it's just what's done, and there are varying degrees of like how much cutting is done. Like it's pretty gruesome, honestly. If you ever want to like have your heart broken, you could Google female genital mutilation, or maybe just be careful about how you Google that, because you might come up with some real weird stuff. But like, it is a cultural phenomenon. And so my point is, the UN Population Fund is doing very important work. They are not going out. Oh, so the other quote from this chapter suggests that they are promoting and implementing China's sterilization policy. I'll find it while we're chatting here, because I highlighted that one too. So one thing that the UN Population Fund does not attempt to implement China's forced sterilization policy. That's not what's happening.
Not accurate.
Yeah, it's not accurate. And they are doing work in China, which is great. And so the kinds of services that are being provided, but not just this agency, but like many partners. If there is reproductive health in the package of services, and that package of services includes anything promoting abortion, the proposal here is that we pull funding from that. And so that's
ultimately,
out with bathwater.
Yeah, ultimately, I think that is the most important thing, right? Is just there's not a discernment. It is a sweeping situation. Now, because I found this also a fascinating rhinestone, I'm going to mention it.
Okay.
But not that the chapter authors talk to each other, because that is very apparent that did not occur. But right. There is a statement in the DHHS chapter. If you only listen to one of these, if you're listening to this, go listen to DHHS chapter 14. It explicitly states that miscarriage treatment and ectopic pregnancy medical care should never be conflated with abortion. And I don't think Texas read that.
I was going to say, that would be really good to let us know here in the U.S.
Right, we should know this. So there's a possibility of discernment that is inside of the mandate for leadership. So it could happen. But the overall language is, if it's close, it's out, right? And on that same note, because I want to make sure that we're managing time and getting through all the other rabbit holes, right? Is that currently there is faith-based organizations or faith-based NGOs do not receive this kind of funding, and they want to open that up. They want to, because there's no longer a contradiction. It says faith-based orgs and NGOs, as well as the private sector, should be able to have access to funding to these programs, to be able to bid, for lack of better words, on the programs on a global level, because it's all about protecting the opportunity for the private sector.
So I'm really glad that you mentioned this, because faith-based organizations is another point of emphasis in this chapter. And one of the reasons why it can be difficult for faith-based organizations to get federal funding is because, much in the same way that we cannot use federal dollars to fund abortion, we cannot use federal dollars to proselytize. And so if the faith-based organization is doing work that does not include proselytization, it is possible for them to receive federal funding. And so I am under the impression that the desire is to remove that restriction, or to at least really lean into trying to find ways to be able to make it more accessible for faith-based organizations to achieve federal funding. The other thing that I didn't find anything to support this is just my personal impression on this, is that the requirements for federal contracts for having anti-discrimination terms in your, so like essentially like DEI terminology in federal contracts, which so requiring federal contracts.
Specifically DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, gender, anything related to gender. So we're talking about gender equality, gender equity, gender diverse, gender aware, gender sensitive, anything related to the word gender, climate change, and critical race theory, or CRT.
Yes.
Keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yes. And so now, right now, there is language in federal contracts that requires federal contractors to observe non-discrimination principles. And so the it is sometimes possible that a faith-based organization might not be inclusive in their own hiring
Right.
practices. And so that is another barrier to federal funding for faith-based organizations.
Right. And because it's in all the chapters, Mandate for Leadership is very aware that non-discrimination is illegal, and it positions itself when it, by it, I mean it is being this very upper class white Christian male educated community. When it loses an opportunity or feels that it's losing access to an opportunity because of these equitable interventions, that is discrimination.
Right.
That's the premise that we're operating under. So they would say big fans of non-discrimination, but they're not including the power or systems of oppression in what that sentence actually means, because they feel discriminated against because their private sector capitalistic equity building opportunity should have preferential treatment. It doesn't have preferential treatment by virtue of not having preferential treatment. Doesn't have preferential treatment. Does that make sense? On the same line, ASAP, immediate action, is around general counsel, which through multiple executive orders support faith-based funding, private sector, and looks at the human capital and talent management specifically of all of these different federally funding programs to prioritize people who are, quote, nonpartisan civil servants who are loyal to the president's agenda. Urgent. Okay. If you have any brain left, let's talk about humanitarian assistance.
Oh man,
Right?
I feel like my brain is just getting warmed up. Like I'm almost ready to start this conversation.
Almost ready. Perfect. And we're almost done.
Yeah.
But the point is, so that people don't actually have to wade through everything, let's just like touch on what's going on. So when we get to humanitarian assistance, what we're talking about is disaster assistance, World Food Program, things related to hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, right? But we're also talking about Ukraine, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Burma, Iraq, like just some of the major programs for humanitarian assistance. All of that programming would be aligned with this agenda so that whatever this agenda is prioritizing, that is what it is giving the countries that we are giving humanitarian assistance to, or they can't have it. So pulling back any funding or assistance that is not aligned with this particular agenda in the middle of, I don't know, wartime, massive drought, significant poverty, pandemics.
Yeah, and I mean, in the sense that they want to require those who are delivering that aid to be adhering to this agenda. So it just it there is so the good news. Okay, so the good news in all of this is we're still gonna have a 20, 30, 40, depending on who who's cutting the checks. Billion, 20, 30, 40 billion dollars in aid delivery. So that's good, depending on what decade it is and what the budget is. And we're going to continue to deliver this aid. And the good news is good work is going to continue to get done. And the bad news is there's going to be some strings attached, and it's going to what I want is for people not to lose hope that the US can still be an agent for good in the world.
Yes.
That
And there are good people doing good work. I mean, so USAID was started by Kennedy in 1961, right? Like there it is started from the doing of the goods, right? Like I was in the Peace Corps. Like there's a lot of problems related to colonization and like the US's entitlement or audacity that it's the best way. But to limit what the US best way is almost to me like counter to what these aid programs are really supposed to be when we're talking about basic rights for humans to thrive.
Yes. There is also like real tangible harm done to vulnerable populations who are receiving this aid if, for example, an organization that is providing a variety of services but also provides abortion services is suddenly yanked from their service to a vulnerable population. Like there's a period of time where that population is now even more underserved than it was before. And so this was actually something that happened with the thing that we've been talking about with the abortion services. That is the Mexico City policy was actually, I think, a Reagan policy. And that was, so this idea has been done.
This is the Protecting Life in a Global Health Assistance Program, which we need to immediately put back into action. Yes.
Very little in this chapter is a new idea. These ideas have been like coming and going in this sector for decades. So but the data have indicated that in places where the Mexico City policy was implemented, the rates of abortion actually went up because the other reproductive health services that agencies were providing, such as access to contraception, access to sex education, things that were helping the population that was being served, when those things went away, abortion rates went up. So it was actually counterproductive in terms of if your goal was to reduce abortion, you take away the funding for the agencies that are providing these reproductive health services, then the abortion rates go up. So I've lost my train of thought and I don't remember.
No, you're nailing it. You're totally nailing it.
Humanitarian assistance. So
yeah.
The other point that the author brings up that is totally valid is that often when we are doing humanitarian aid, especially in places where there's conflict zones or where there are corrupt governments, like it is a real problem that the funding is siphoned off for the enrichment of malign actors, is one of the terms that's been here. So like malign actors will siphon off some of that funding so it's not reaching its intended destination. That's a real thing, and that's been going on the whole time. So that's also not a new thing. And that's where we have to like really make hard decisions. And when I say people spend their entire careers studying these things, what I'm like, each one of those things. Syria, yes, somebody has spent their entire career studying the positive and negative effects of aid in Syria. Same thing Yemen, same thing Afghanistan. Like the stuff going on in Afghanistan right now, that has undone many of the steps that we tried to take forward when we were intervening in Afghanistan are just heartbreaking. And so like the question is, do we cut off aid or do we continue to operate within a corrupt system with the knowledge that our efforts are being hampered by the corrupt system in which we're operating?
Which brings us back to this agenda, not that agenda, is that it's not, that there is a icing in Mandate for Leadership, which is something I actually am like, okay, let's see what happens, is doing an audit to reduce duplication, reduce bureaucracy, make things more streamlined, make things more transparent, open, easy, and functional to the average person. That sounds great. You do not even know what those words mean, because in this chapter, there is a very strong declaration, right? No citations, no references, but strong declaration that because of this corruption, we have to transfer away from all these very large awards because of corruption. But the only people being accused of corruption are people who don't align with this agenda. So to me, the scariest thing in the chapter, which is kind of there's a lot of competition for what could be the scariest thing in this chapter, but the idea of leveraging aid-based programs with real vulnerable people in the balance, specifically for private sector solutions who are going to bid on what services they will provide at what cost for those federal dollars in the meantime, a war has broken out. In the meantime, Ebola has broken out. In the meantime, like a hurricane has devastated what's going on. The negotiation period being reduced down in my mind to like a really slick PowerPoint is really painful to me, and honestly feels very disrespectful, to your point, to the career-long, passionate, educated people who are ready to go at any second with the pros and cons of what to do and where to do that's culturally appropriate in different places where they need help, including inside the United States. The United States also benefits from its own USAID programs because there are communities in our country that also are suffering and do not have access to things like potable water and housing and food. There's food deserts and things like this. That is also where this funding is coming from. And the private sector hasn't stepped up to solve our problems. That to me was the like scary pants.
Yeah,
Scary,
he
scary
actually
pants.
says that he wants to that the world will benefit from U.S. taxpayers' generosity and charity, like
Mm,
from the private sector. It's like,
yeah,
yeah,
that
I mean, so
I'm not saying that it has not happened, but I am declaring that these problems have not gone away because of the US private sector, to which the US private sector is inside of these communities where these needs are met, and it's not happening yet.
yes.
So, all right, so now that we've possibly put everybody to sleep, or at least should we take a second so you can schedule a therapy appointment? Okay. Now that we're playing again, um, what do we need to do as regular normal people, right? Regular normal people over here. These are our tax dollars
Mhm.
being used. I think sometimes it's an action and sometimes it's a question. And
Sure.
so I'm going to say, in your local community, what are the largest financial powerhouses in the private sector of your local community? And then find out what they are doing to support your local municipalities, your county, and maybe the state. If part of the mandate of leadership is tossing everything to local municipalities, if we take Stephanie, and full disclosure, we live in the same county, different towns, but same county. Um, if we take the number one employer, which I believe is our local hospital, St. Joe's, I think that's the number one employer, followed probably closely by the university, if not the county itself. I bet those are the top three. That would be my guess. So the county itself is using county funding to support the county. So I'm just going to remove that as a variable. So our recently privatized hospital that is aligned with a Catholic agenda, question marks. What is St. Joe's doing with its profits to support Humboldt County? I do not know this answer, but I feel like it is my responsibility as a resident here to be able to figure that out. The university, what is it doing to support its local community, not just its students, faculty, staff, coaches, librarians, or what is it doing to support the local community? I think that's a good starting place of looking at your largest financially viable private sectors in your very, very local community and find out what are they doing. And I'm not talking t-shirts on a softball team. What are your thoughts? What
Uh,
homework would you give people?
so one thing that I found like most invigorating about this process was how many questions I had once I started reading. And I think that one thing that people can do to feel less overwhelmed is to just like start Googling stuff and find out what the hell are they even talking about? Like
Right.
where and then the next thing that gave me like a warm fuzzy feeling was the list that he writes of agencies who are doing work overseas that he really thinks we should probably not fund so much. And I was like, oh well, those are probably like going to be top of the list when I'm looking for places to donate time
Right.
and money. Like,
Right.
oh, he just gave me a starting point because there's five or six where he's like, oh, I highlighted them. I should say them out loud. I'll find it so that people who actually listen this far in can. But anyway, or just any of the agencies and organizations that they object to. now those are on my thumbs up list. And so I want to learn more about the work that they're doing. And I want to know how I can support that work. So
We'll do a double whammy. So you highlighted them. So I don't think I wrote them down in my notes. But if you give me them, I will put them in the show notes of this video. So
cool.
these are the individual organizations that are potentially going to lose funding if this works.
Yeah, yeah.
And maybe that is something that you research and see, does this make sense? Does it align with your own family's needs, beliefs, values, etc.? And is there a way that you can support some of them that might potentially be losing their federal funding? That's a really great idea. So give me the list. I'll add it to the show notes.
Okay.
The last thing that I want to say, first off, well, my last thing is thank you. So, Stephanie, I know that when we were talking and preparing for this, that you were nervous about not being an expert enough. And part of the reason I want to use regular, normal people is that I think the greatest act of resistance is utilizing your own community and reconnecting with your network. The people who wrote these 30 some odd chapters did not talk to each other, and they're organized. They got a plan. So we need to stay organized. And after this election, I think a lot of us realized that we are an organized minority voice right now, but we have to stay organized. And if we don't stay a community supporting one another, then I think they're going to win. So that's number one. You're great. The other thing I'm going to say, and we actually role modeled it here on this call, if people are actually watching all of these videos, and if that's the case, like just fold your laundry. Like, what are you procrastinating? But confusing the Helm Amendment and the Hyde Amendment. I think sometimes this is by design so that they are doing government stuff and we're just kind of bebopping around. So Google while you can. And don't beat yourself up for conflating them. They're sound similar, they're kind of close, and they're basically somebody's religious agenda limiting tax dollar funding, which is kind of amazing considering in theory we have a separation of church and state. I'm probably going to light on fire saying that this close to the Project 2025 PDF. But don't beat yourself up. Just do your homework and learn. And then you'll forget. And that's regular and by design. And we need to get over the need to get everything right and be perfect and prepared, etc. And what we really need to do is ask questions and recognize I don't know the answer. I had no idea. I didn't know what USAID. I didn't know what it meant. I think honestly, I thought it was the Food and Drug Administration, maybe. And like I was like, is that like what like defines meat as good quality? Answer: no. Nope, sure isn't. And if I'm kind of paying attention and I can be that wrong, there's nothing wrong with being wrong if you're getting ready to be right.
I love that.
Yeah.
I learned so much just because of the kinds of questions that reading this chapter, like, I don't know how much I learned from the chapter itself, but all of the questions that it inspired made me feel really like awake and alive. And so I really I'm so glad that you like convinced me to do this because yeah, because like I remember I was interested in these things once and I stopped paying attention. Who has the emotional energy to pay attention to everything that's going on? But it felt so good to like seek answers and to realize that there are a lot of, and speaking of other resources, like I hope you'll also put in the notes the Stop the Coup resource and the one that's got the graphic like cartoon.
The Florida one. Yep.
The one with where artists have done like cartoons to demonstrate that. Oh, it is Florida. Okay. Anyway, they're wonderful. There's so many smart people who are working on this and like working to make these ideas accessible. And I have loved just over the last couple of weeks, like feeling some agency. So I don't have to just take whatever is happening and just take it. I can call out, and when I hear things, so it's been really frustrating to be reading things that come at us from a partisan angle and to just notice that the language that they're using is designed intentionally to obfuscate and to confuse and to paint a picture that pits us against one another when and like, okay, and this might be a little like, this is a little off the wall here, but like that section that we read about human rights, like we actually agree on that. Like we agree that people have basic human rights and that we have like a moral obligation as a society to help other people in the world like achieve those basic human rights. And so maybe if we can find little nuggets like that where we can, that's a point of common ground.
Right. And so we're out of time, but I'm going to name that if we talk about the agreement of basic human rights, the disagreement is on what we're giving human rights to.
Yes.
Right. So every human has the right to potable water as an example, and trans and non-binary people are humans.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So that's where we're disagreeing is the definition of
human. We're only disagreeing on who's human and who's not.
Right. Right. But how much time are we spending? I think this is a very important point. How much time are we spending defending the right to water when in theory we agree with that? We are spending a lot of time on things that in theory we agree about so that we are not arguing about the things that we actually are actionably watching erode the rights of other people. And so we need to be arguing and using our terms and our energy and our money and our resources towards real problems, not ones that get our attention.
Yeah.
Stephanie, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I super do. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
I can't wait to do it again.